We have been told, at least I know I've been told, that vegetables are super healthy for you and you need to eat lots of them, right? And this is true to a certain degree, but at the same time, they actually have these things in them, some more than others, called anti-nutrients. And that's what we're going to be talking about today because some people with chronic illnesses have a lot of trouble with vegetables because of those anti-nutrients in them. We're going to be talking about what they are, how they affect your body, and what you can actually do about them to continue to eat your vegetables, hopefully, and at the same time to make sure that you're cutting down on those anti-nutrients. Welcome back to the Holistic Healing with Lori podcast. I'm Lori Rivers, and I'm your Get Back to Health coach. I coach people with long COVID and ME/CFS, fibromyalgia, other chronic illnesses to teach them how to fully recover using my Relief and Transformation online course. So let's talk about these weird anti-nutrients. The way that I think about this is that animals can run away, right? So that's their defense mechanism. That's how they stay alive for the most part, right? Plants can't run away. So they have over time developed these anti-nutrients, which can cause problems for the things that eat the plants. And they are appropriately named as anti-nutrients because one of the things that they do is they actually oppose the action of essential nutrients. And these are the vitamins and minerals that are in our diet. And they do that by blocking our body's ability to digest and absorb them and use them properly. Now, there are also anti-nutrients that actually cause physical damage to the body in all sorts of different areas as well. So we'll be talking about that too. And these anti-nutrients are also sometimes the underlying cause of lots of gut issues, like IBS, like leaky gut syndrome, like a lot of these things that you might be dealing with if you have a chronic illness. So, because they are naturally occurring in lots of these foods, lots of vegetables, even super healthy ones, you want to know where they are in your foods and how you can approach them so that they aren't going to cause you problems, right? So, again, we've been taught through the years that plants, your vegetables, you want to make sure that you're eating them. And we expect that to be true because we've been told that over and over again. But again, some of these compounds that are naturally occurring in plants are actually poisonous to us. And some, well, and we'll talk about this more in a different post, in a different podcast episode, but a lot of plants contain a lot of one of the biggest anti-nutrients that was not naturally occurring originally, and that's Roundup, right? So we need to be aware of these things. And we need to remember that while plants can be healthy for us, some do contain these natural compounds that are working against us, right? I've actually had several students, and this is myself included, who developed such sensitivities to plants, to vegetables, that they needed to go completely carnivore for a while. And we'll talk more about that in another podcast as well. But what we found was that it really gave the body a break for a time to be able to not be having to deal with those anti-nutrients. As we said, the anti-nutrients are the plant's way of fighting back because it can't run away, right? This is the plant's way to keep themselves from being eaten to extinction. So they create these natural chemicals that can cause a degree of sickness, or if they're overeaten, then it can make us feel a little queasy. And so animals and insects don't eat them as much. Now, humans and animals have typically and typically will in the future always have some type of plants in their diet. But some of these anti-nutrients that we're going to be talking about are extremely toxic. while and very noticeable, while others kind of act in the background and have almost unnoticeable effects on our health. But then when you start digging deeper, you can see that they're having more of an effect on your health possibly than originally thought. These anti-nutrients, you'll find them the most in grains, seeds, legumes, beans, and nuts, but they're also in plant roots, stems, and leaves. Just an example, we'll be talking more about this in just a bit here. But for example, spinach, which we've been told is so good for us, is very high in an anti-nutrient called oxalates. And we'll get more into that. But again, just really paying attention to and becoming more well informed about these anti-nutrients and where they occur. So one of the unfortunate things is that there's not a way to know exactly how many anti-nutrients are in each food that you eat, but we do have a rough idea. So we'll take a look at that. And most people don't need to eliminate every single one from their diets, and certainly not long term. But short term, it might be helpful for sure. Yeah. And also, what we know is that people do vary as far as their sensitivities to these anti nutrients. And that means one of the things that I teach in the Relief and Transformation course is that all of this is an experiment, right? So you'll probably need to do some experimentation on yourself to narrow down which anti nutrients might be having a negative impact on your health. One of the ways that you can see if you are reactive or sensitive to these anti nutrients is to see how you feel after you eat certain foods, right? And again, sometimes this is cumulative. So if you are experiencing long COVID, if you are experiencing chronic fatigue syndrome, if you are experiencing fibromyalgia or other chronic illnesses, then honestly, you're most likely going to have some sensitivities to several of these anti nutrients. But some of the specific symptoms that you might experience and that you might notice right after you eat a certain food is fatigue. Very familiar with that, right? Nausea, brain fog, IBS, diarrhea, bloating, and gas. So let's get to some of the specifics here. One of the big ones that lots of people know about is gluten, right? It's like a buzzword. We all have heard the word gluten, but maybe we don't know exactly what it is. So gluten is actually it's a family of proteins that's found in grains like wheat and barley and rye. And they're wonderful for making things like bread and crackers and stuff like that, but they can cause a lot of trouble, especially if you're dealing with celiac disease or non celiac gluten sensitivity. Now, I specifically, in the Relief and Transformation Eating Plan, we don't eat any types of grains, and that includes actually also any oats, corn, all those things. Now, not all of those grains have gluten in them, but just in general, it's best to stay away from all of these all of these grains when you're dealing with a chronic illness. But let's talk about some of the symptoms of traditional celiac disease. And that can include skin problems, it can include gut issues, it can include neurological issues as well. One of the main things that I used to experience when I was sick and when I would eat brain fog, confusion, depression, I would get seriously depressed for the next 2 days, usually, at least, like to the point where I was crying all the time. And that was not normal for me. No, I haven't had gluten in a very long time. I'll have it every once in a while now because I am fully healed, but I still mostly stay away from it. So, also, any sensitivities in those who, let's say that you get tested for celiac disease and the tests come back negative, then you might actually be having problems from other proteins that are present in grain-based products like lectins, which we'll be talking about more later on. But in general, I just say stay away from the grains. It's not worth it. Now, it's a big shift, but you'll find in one of my other podcasts where we talk more about these foods that can cause symptoms. We'll talk more about things that you can focus on eating as opposed to looking at it as looking at it as being depleted of these things that you want to be eating. Unfortunately, actually, gluten-free diets are more and more prominent and more common. When I first started eating gluten-free and grain-free, it was like 20 plus years ago and was not really a thing at that point, right? So luckily, there are more options for us out there now. The other thing about gluten is that there is not a human protein or enzyme that can actually break down gluten. And that's totally a fact. So when we eat gluten, these partially broken clumps of that protein, of that gluten protein, are actually floating around in our bloodstream. And those are called gluteomorphins. And our immune system actually reacts with them. And that can be what leads to a lot of those symptoms of gluten intolerance. Now, what's really super interesting about this too is that these gluteomorphins also bind to opioid receptors in the brain like morphine does, which triggers the production of endorphins. And those are feel-good hormones. What happens is you eat the bread or the pasta or whatever it is, which activates those endorphins. So it makes you think that you feel good. You do feel good when you eat these gluten containing foods. But then what you find is that you feel worse afterwards and that you need more and more of the bread or the muffin or the bagel or whatever. You need more and more of it to get that feel good response. So it is literally addictive. It's like morphine. That's crazy, right? Now, gluten, unlike some of the other anti-nutrients we're going to be talking about, doesn't always bind to minerals or other nutrients to limit their absorption directly, but it can cause nutrient deficiencies in other ways. Because gluten can cause a lot of inflammation and irritation in the gut, and gluten can actually damage the gut barrier, which disrupts normal nutrient absorption. And not only that, but the gut microbiome is negatively affected because of that poor gut functioning. And it can cause leaky gut. It can actually cause some rips and tears in your intestinal lining, which means that not only is your body not able to properly absorb these nutrients that we're talking about, but it's also allowing parasites, fungus, these bad microbes to go into the bloodstream and be carried throughout the body so that these parasites and fungus and other bad microbes can actually flourish in these other parts of your body. Also, keep in mind now, as gluten-free diets started to become more popular, you start to see more and more gluten-free products in the grocery store, right? And so the initial response is like, yeah, I can eat these. But then when you start looking at the ingredients that are in there, a lot of times they contain a lot of sugar and they're still very high in carbs. And one of the things that we want to limit while you are treating the underlying issues that are causing chronic illness is you want to have a low carb diet. So I would say just stay away from those gluten-free products that you do find in the grocery store or online because they're highly processed. And again, they have a whole bunch of stuff that you just shouldn't be eating in there. the best choice is always going to be super simple. It's like straight low carb veg and your healthy meats and animal products. And we'll talk more about dairy at another point, not in this podcast. So, our next anti nutrient, and we're going to talk about my favorite one in just a little bit, which is oxalates. And it's my favorite because it's so fascinating and because of the impact that it can have on you. So it's my favorite in a not good way. But let's talk about lectins, right? So you may have heard of lectins before as well. It's more known than some of the other ones. And you've probably seen possibly some lectin-free diets coming around. Lectins are found in all plants, but especially in raw nuts and raw legumes, actually. So these are things like peanuts, beans, soy, lentils, and then also your whole grains like wheat are very high in lectins. So when we're talking about lectins, we're talking about the part of the plant that develops into the leaves when the plant sprouts. And this is also called the seed coat. And this contains the most lectins. Fruits and vegetables, they do contain lectins, but the main vegetable that has the most lectin in it is your nightshades. Now, these are things like tomatoes, potatoes, and eggplants. And the word nightshades, it sounds sinister, right? So you might be able to remember it more easily that way. So lectins, the way that they work is they are carbohydrate binding proteins, which means that they are plant proteins that when you eat them, when they're ingested, they cause clumping of carbohydrates in our bodies, which is not a good thing. We're going to talk about why. So, whether that's happening in your gut or in your bloodstream or in your muscles or other tissues, maybe even in your organs, lectins they seek out any sugar molecules and they stick to them. And our immune system goes, oh crap, we need to take care of that. And it responds to these sticky clumps by using inflammation, right? Because that's the immune system's response to get things ready to get them out of the body. But what happens is that by binding to the cell surfaces, these lectins interfere with this cell to cell communication and disrupt that immune function. They disrupt the normal functioning in our bodies. Also, again, if we're talking about gut health, the lectins actually bind to the cells of the gut lining and damage them and weaken the gut barrier. And this results as well in what we were talking about earlier with the gluten. It results in the leaky gut. And that allows those other proteins that shouldn't be in our bloodstream and lectins themselves and these bad microbes, parasites, fungus, viruses, other things to go into the bloodstream, which is where those critters want to be because they're able to be protected in other areas of the body and because they're able to get to other areas of the body. And really that gut barrier is what's supposed to keep them out of there. So lectins are pretty bad there. Now, another thing is that, again, once these lectins and other things get into our bloodstream, our immune system detects them and launches an immune response and produces antibodies. And you can start to get a feel for how your body can start to have an overactive immune system and to develop things like autoimmune illnesses and things like MCAS and other things like that, right? And then also a leaky gut is, again, it's going to prevent normal absorption of your essential nutrients. So watch out for lichen. Again, it's a good reason to stay away from your grains, and even from your nuts and seeds. All right, let's talk about phytates. We've got the countdown to oxalate happening here. So, phytate, or also called phytic acid, has a bunch of anti nutritional properties because it chelates to calcium, iron, and zinc. Now, my guess is that you probably know that calcium, iron, and zinc are important nutrients for our body, for our cells to act normally and healthily. So basically, what phytic acid does is that it actually binds to these minerals and forms complexes that can't be absorbed by the gut properly. So it turns calcium, iron, and zinc into something that's not calcium, iron, and zinc, and then the body can't use it. And again, this is one of those anti nutrients that we actually, as humans, cannot metabolize. We can't metabolize phytic acid. So this also ends up building up in our body too. And so it's floating around in our body, which leaves it in a place where it can bind to all these minerals from our diet, right? Also, on top of limiting our mineral bioavailability by glomming onto these essential nutrients that we need, phytates, phytic acid, can also bind to the protein from our diet. And that prevents protein degrading enzymes, which includes proteases. So we're not able to metabolize the proteins. And this means that we end up developing even more nutritional deficiencies, right? It's a good thing to stay away from again. And phytates are present only in plants, and most of them are found in seeds. So this is what you're going to start hearing over and over again, is that your grains you want to stay away from, your seeds you want to stay away from. Now, there's a way around the seeds. In the first part of the relief and transformation eating plan, which most people are usually on for 6+ months, we don't do any nuts or seeds because of these anti nutrients. We want to give the body as much of an advantage and make things as easy as possible. So we don't even mess with the nuts and seeds. Now, what a way that you can get around this, and what we recommend once you've gone through that first part of the relief and transformation eating plan, is to use sprouted seed, right? All of these edible seeds that we're talking about, and small amounts of roots and tuber plants. So your carrots and your potatoes and things like that, they also have these phytates in there. Just like with all of these anti-nutrients, and we're going to talk more about this, but when you ferment them, soak them, mill them, sprout them, and cooking them can reduce that phytate content. The iron and the zinc, these are two minerals that we get from our diet that are very affected by the phytic acid in plants. And the absorption of what's called non-heme iron, which is the form of iron that plants provide, is influenced by those phytates. And so people with iron deficiency, or vegans or vegetarians, you have to be really careful. And I personally don't recommend a vegan or vegetarian diet if you're dealing with a chronic illness. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's just what I've found for my students over the past 20 years, and for myself as well. Yeah, and this is also why it's important that if you are choosing to go vegan or vegetarian, that you need to eat more iron containing foods. But then you get into that issue of, okay, it still contains phytic acid, this vegetable that I'm eating. And so that phytic acid is taking a big chunk of that iron. Now, phytates do have some positive health effects like antioxidant properties and other things, but it just depends on where you are in your health journey right now. Okay, guess where we are? We're at oxalates. Now, these are really interesting. And they're in a lot of foods that we've been told are superfoods. I mentioned spinach already. They're also in kale, in broccoli and cauliflower. Not as much, depending on who you talk to, though, which is interesting. Now, if you like chocolate, I hate to tell you this, but chocolate, so cacao, has a huge amount of oxalate in it. Also, black pepper, beet, radishes, and nuts, almonds especially, very high in oxalate. And typically, there are more oxalate in the younger plants and fewer in the older plants. Now, oxalates are actually, they're really interesting. They are these small crystals and they literally have sharp edges on them and they're teeny tiny. And so, what they actually do is they end up damaging your gut and any other places that they've gotten into in your body because they literally cut away at whatever they're in. They're not alive or anything, but they can cause not a lot of problems. That was one of the things that I realized for myself after a while because I started to have these little bumps on my skin and they weren't bites, they were itchy a little bit, but and every once in a while one would erupt and a little crystal would come out. It looked like a piece of sand. And then I also developed a sty that would come up in my eye every once in a while, like once every 3 months or something. And it would spit out what I now know as an oxalate crystal as well. Now, this is not just me, and it depends from person to person for sure, a lot, right? For example, one of my students in the relief and transformation course, she has a real oxalate problem right now. And the other thing that contributes to this is that most people, I'm going to say all people who have chronic illness, there's a dysbiosis in the microbiome, which is not just the gut. It is certainly mostly in the gut, but it's the whole body. And that dysbiosis means that there are many more of the bad microbes in the body than the good ones. And the thing is, some of those bad microbes produce, guess what? Oxalate, right? So this particular student, she said, my husband and I wake up in the mornings and it's like we're at the beach because her skin is releasing so much oxalate. So that's something that we'll be addressing for her as she's going through the course. And again, we're going to talk about some ways that you can reduce some of these anti-nutrients that are going in. Like these other anti-nutrients that we've been talking about, oxalate, not only does it cause physical damage because of the sharpness of the crystals, but it does also block mineral absorption, right? Mainly calcium. And this is because oxalates bind to calcium and other minerals as well, like iron. And they do that in the gut when we eat food or in the bloodstream or the kidneys. So again, like we were talking about earlier with spinach contains calcium and a ton of oxalates. And spinach was touted as this superfood and really healthy thing to eat for a while because it's so high in calcium. But most of that calcium is absorbed with the oxalates when you eat spinach. And again, these little crystals, they can be deposited anywhere in the body, in the tissues. So some of the symptoms that you might find that you have if you have these oxalate issues is joint pain, burning eyes, burning mouth, burning ears, burning throat. And again, you're not going to go to a doctor and they're going to say, oh, you might have an oxalate problem. And the other issue with a lot of these anti-nutrients is that there aren't any really good tests that are very accurate to see if it is a problem for you. If you are having some of these issues, one of the ways that I personally know that oxalate was a problem for me is that before I really got serious about I went through a phase where I was eating dark chocolate, not just a little bit, and not every day or anything like that. But after I would eat that dark chocolate, I had to go to the bathroom. It was like to pee. It was like I couldn't hold it. And in talking with Sally Norton, who is an absolute expert in the area of oxalates, and we'll probably give you a link to her information in the description here. But after speaking with her, she was like, oh, yeah, that's definitely an indication that you have an oxalate issue. There were some other things that I noticed as well. Now, the way that you most likely have heard of oxalates is in the form of kidney stones. And the way that happens is that the kidneys clean our blood by removing the toxins or waste and putting them into the urine, right? So when we absorb too much oxalate, they get excreted in the urine, but they can also crystallize with that calcium and form the kidney stones. And that also explains why my body just said, we got to pee all of this stuff out now. And it would happen for the rest of the day and sometimes moving on into the next day. I just had to make sure that I was next to a toilet. So that's actually a good sign because it meant that my body was getting rid of it. If the oxalate load is too high, and if you do have those bad microbes that are creating more oxalate, then you have to take a different approach to this. And we're talking about about how every once in a while I'll recommend a pure carnivore diet for some of my students to begin with. And for people who are dealing with oxalate issues, that can be very helpful because, again, it just takes out all of those anti-nutrient possibilities in there, right? Yeah. So people who are affected by oxalates can be helped by that approach. Now, also, there are some ways to lessen the anti-nutrient load in your foods. So certainly, and it depends on how ill you are, right? As to how much of this you want to be following. But oxalates, like a lot of the other anti-nutrients, can be reduced in foods by cooking them and then draining the water. You can also soak them in acid, which is lemon juice and things like that. Also, having a low level of dietary calcium too low, can increase the amount that you absorb of oxalate because calcium actually binds to oxalate in the gut and stops it from being absorbed. So you want to be choosing low oxalate vegetables and not eating very much raw vegetables because those are typically higher in oxalate. Remember, we talked about cooking them first. And again, Sally Norton's website is a great place to take a look at all these. Some of the top 10 anti-nutrient foods we're looking at here are chickpeas. They contain a ton of phytic acid. Almonds, and I don't know about you, but I was addicted to almond butter and almonds for years and years. And they're very high in oxalates and in phytates as well. Peanuts are high in lectins and phytates also. Potatoes are high in oxalate and phytates. Corn, very high in phytates. Remember earlier I was talking about how we lump corn into that grains category and we say no to that. Spinach, like I've said a couple of times, very high in oxalate. One other thing I forgot to mention about spinach is maybe you can think of the last time you had raw spinach, like a big clump of it on its own. And you might notice that kind of feeling on your tongue that's scratchy or uncomfortable. I don't know. It makes me crazy. That's the oxalate. That's on your tongue. Wheat. Wheat has like all of them. Wheat has lectins, phytates, oxalates, and gluten, which are all the ones that we've been talking about. Soybeans, and this is why I do not recommend soy either. Fermented soy, I don't even recommend in the earlier stages. But soybeans have lectins, phytates, and oxalates. Kidney beans have lectins, and tomatoes have lectins. And there are others. Like we said, a lot of the superfoods that we've been told, a lot of those are high in oxalate and some of these others as well. Yes, we do get nourishment from nutrient in plants, but then we also have to take into account these anti-nutrients that block our ability to absorb those nutrients, right? And what are some of those extra steps that we can take here? Again, what we talked about is cooking these vegetables very well. If you're just set on using nuts and seeds in your diet, then make sure that they are sprouted. And also, like we talked about earlier, that I think it was the lectins specifically are the outer part of the nut or seed, that seed case, then getting those is going to be helpful as well, and not consuming those. So if you think about the stuff on the outside of almonds that makes it dark, that's what you want to be staying away from. So if you can get the almonds that don't have that stuff on the outside. And what else? Sometimes soaking them in acid like lemon or vinegar if you tolerate vinegar. And yeah, again, for some people, you probably, if you're dealing with a chronic illness, you probably just want to stay away from these vegetables that are higher in these particular ones, and these particular anti-nutrients. Let me know if you have any questions. Please do make sure to subscribe to Holistic Healing with Lori, because we have tons more helpful podcasts like this with information and help in the areas of holistic health, of how to approach these difficult illnesses. So thank you so much for being here with us, and just know that there is hope and there is help. Lots of love. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Holistic Healing with Lori podcast. And I do hope that you found our conversation enlightening and helpful. That is always my goal. If you did, I have a small favor to ask. Please do consider leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. That would really, really help us, not only to improve, but also to help others to discover the podcast. And especially if you know someone who is navigating their way through ME/CFS, through long COVID, fibromyalgia, or any chronic illness, please also share this podcast with them. You know, my mission is to reach as many people as possible, to instill this feeling of hope and help, and to share the insights and strategies that I know really work to help them on their healing journey. And just remember that you're not alone in this. We're in this all together, learning and growing and healing. And I'll see you next time.